think last time we ended, we were at chapter 23. And what we see here is one of his so-called friends, Eliphaz, had made 3 accusations against Job in chapter 22. And he had said that Job is a sinner. Well, Job knows that that's not correct. The second thing is, he says that Job is hiding his sins. In other words, he's being a hypocrite. Job says, no, that's not it. And then Eliphaz says, you have to repent of your sins. And once again, he's talking to the wrong man. And so Job comes out in chapter 23, and Job has 3 complaints against the Lord. The first one is that God is hiding from me. That's in the first 12 verses. And again, this was Job's appeal to God to have a fair trial, to meet him in court, if you will, and let God give the verdict on that. And he wanted a personal meeting with God. He wanted to ask him personally all these questions and give his own particular arguments. But Job, throughout this whole ordeal, he doesn't understand what's going on. He doesn't understand why it's going on, which is where we all get to at some point. But God knew exactly where Job was. He was in the furnace, and the furnace was supplied by God. God was in control of how long this was going to go on, how intense this was going to get, although it's difficult to imagine that it could have gotten much more intense than what it already was. But it's a great comfort that God is sovereign and he's in control of everything. The second complaint he has in verses 13 through 17, he said, God is frightening me. Job realizes that God is the God, the only true God. There are no other gods. And so he knows there's nowhere else he can go to try and get help except to God. And the other thing in chapter 24, he says that God perplexes me. And this is where we'll start at today in chapter 24. This chapter focuses on the seeming injustices that we see in this world, that God permits in this world. And then Job opens his speech by asking, basically, why doesn't God have specific days to hold the court? Because then I could show up on that day and I could tell him how to run the world. In verses 1 through 11, what we see, these injustices in the country is accounted for. Why are times not stored up by the Almighty, and why do those who know him not see his days? Some remove the landmarks. They seize and devour flocks. They drive away the donkeys of the orphans. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. They push the needy aside from the road. The poor of the land are made to hide themselves altogether. Behold, as wild donkeys in the wilderness, they go forth seeking food in their activity, as bread for their children in the desert. They harvest their fodder in the field, and they glean the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked, without clothing, and have no covering against the cold. They are wet with the mountain rains, and they hug the rock for want of a shelter. Others snatch the orphan from the breast, and against the poor they take a pledge. They cause the poor to go about naked without clothing, and they take away the sheaves from the hungry. Within the walls they produce oil. They tread wine presses. They tread wine presses, but thirst. So what he's talking about are these injustices in the country. And at that particular time, there were no walls or fences that separated the farmlands. Each family had a plot, and what we see in Deuteronomy is these reference to these boundary stones. And that marked their territory, so there was no need for a fence. People knew whose land was whose. In Deuteronomy 27:17, God promises to curse those who move those landmarks and steal the property. But the men would do it just the same. So you're taking an inch at a time, if you will, and over enough time, that can be a pretty significant chunk of land. And so they not only claimed the land, but they also claimed the animals that grazed on that land. So if they're moving the stones out, and say, for instance, there's 10 sheep now in that new section, they say, well, those are my sheep now. These men were very wicked. So they took the flocks and the donkeys and the oxen, all these livestock from the widows and the orphans, and left them in poverty. And God was very gracious to provide for widows and orphans, and instructing us to do the same thing for that particular group of people. In verses 5 through 11, what we see is one of the most graphic pictures of how the poor had to survive that we see anywhere else in the Bible. In verses 5 and 6, they're foraging for food like wild animals. Verse 7, they're freezing because they have no clothing. Verse 8, they're drenched by the rain because they have no houses to live in. In verse 9, they're crying because their children were snatched from their arms until they pay their debts. In 10 and 11, they're forced to work for the rich, and yet they're not allowed to eat of any of the harvest that they produce. So this is injustices in the country. Next, he's going to look at crimes in the city in verses 12 through 17. From the city men groan, and the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not pay attention to folly. Others have been with those who rebel against the light. They do not want to know its ways, nor abide in its paths. The murderer arises at dawn. He kills the poor and the needy, and at night he is a thief. And the eye of the adulterer waits for the twilight, saying, no eye will see me, and he disguises his face. In the dark they dig into houses. They shut themselves up by day. They do not know the light. The morning is the same to him as thick darkness, for he is familiar with the terrors of thick darkness. Verses 12 through 14, Job begins with this picture of murderers. He hears the groans of the wounded, and he sees the death of the innocent. In verse 15 here, we see where Job mentioned sexual sins. He's talking about adultery and rape, and that these men wait for the darkness, because indeed they are deeds of darkness. And also in 16 through 17 is the picture of the thief, who again waits for darkness to break into houses. In verses 18 through 25, what we see here, this is seen as a description. It's a curse on the wicked, if you will, describing what's going to happen to them. So it could either be a description of what's going to happen to them, or Job actually pronounces this curse upon the wicked. It can be taken either way. It's beginning in verse 18. They are insignificant on the surface of the water. Their portion is cursed on the earth. They do not turn toward the vineyards. Drought and heat consume the snow waters. So does Sheol those who have sinned. A mother will forget him. The worm feeds sweetly till he is remembered no more. Wickedness will be broken like a tree. He wrongs the barren woman and does no good for the widow, but he drags off the valiant by his power. He rises, but no one has assurance of life. He provides them with security, and they are supported, and his eyes are on their ways. They are exalted a little while, and then they're gone. Moreover, they are brought low, and like everything gathered up. Even like the heads of grain, they are cut off. Now if it is not so, who can prove me a liar and make my speech worthless? So basically Job is asking his friends, if what I've said is not true, prove me wrong. And of course we know from Scripture that they never did. What we see next here in chapter 25, it's the shortest chapter in the book of Job. And this is Bildad's speech. And so let's read that very quickly. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, dominion and all belong to him who establishes peace in his heights. Is there any number to his troops? And upon whom does his light not rise? How then can a man be just with God, or how can he be clean who is born of woman? If even the moon has no brightness, and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man, that maggot, and a son of man, that worm? So what we see here is Bildad in the first three verses, he's talking about God's power, and then in the last verses, he's talking about God's justice. And you would think the way that they're describing God, that they would know God better, but obviously they don't. And it's not going to be until the end of the book when God reveals himself. In verses 1 through 3, what we see is that God's power is inherent in his nature. He has all dominion and fear, and in some of these places, fear, it'll say awe, which is what we as Christians should have. It's not a not an afraid fear like we're going to get punished for something, but have this fear of great respect and awe for God. And so he says that he reigns sovereignly in the heavens. God has everything under control. He sees what's going on everywhere. And his army of angels is ready to obey his will. And then Bildad asks, who can resist him? Verses 4 through 6, what we see here is God's justice. And God's justice is an outworking of his holy nature. Since God is holy and just, how can just a mere man claim to be righteous before him? We need to remember here that Job is holding fast to his integrity, and he's refusing to confess that his sins are what has brought this judgment on him. And so Bildad asks this question, how can you, Job, claim to be righteous before God? And Job is going to give his reply. In chapter 26 here, what we see is Job's acknowledgment of God's power. So let's read the first 4 verses here. And Job responded, "What a help you are to the weak, how you have saved the arm without strength, what counsel you have given to one without wisdom, what helpful insight you have abundantly provided. To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit was expressed through you?" Job's starting to get pretty tired of what's going on here. And he rebukes Bildad for not giving any help. Job tells him, I've got no power now, and instead of being a good friend and helping me out, you're not making me stronger at all. And as we saw last week, according to his friends, Job lacked the wisdom, but none of his friends shared any wisdom with him, any insight with him. Verse 4, Job accuses him. He says, if your words had come from God, Bildad, these words would have done me some good. So the conclusion is that Bildad's words came from Bildad, and that's why they did Job no good. And I think that's important for us, that when we are trying to understand a particular passage, it's not what we feel about it, it's not what we think about it, it's what God says about it. And that's the difference. Bildad was relying on his own wisdom, if you will. Verses 5 through 13, what we see here is that Job was going to extol the greatness of God. The departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Naked is Sheol before him, and Abaddon has no covering. He stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, and the cloud does not burst under them. He obscures the face of the moon. He spreads his cloud over it. He has inscribed a circle on the surface of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are amazed at his rebuke. He quiets the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his breath the heavens are cleared, and his hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Behold, these are the fringes of his ways, and how faint a word we hear of him, but his mighty thunder who can understand? This is amazing insight. This is before telescopes. This is before modern day physics, if you will. That Job has this incredible insight about how the world really is. Verse 7, he talks here about he hangs the earth on nothing. And of course now we know that's true, right? The theories were out there getting closer and closer, and then if you remember, 1969, I think it was, when we first landed on the moon. But as the astronauts are beaming back these pictures as they're leaving Earth and heading towards the moon, obviously you can see that the Earth is round and nothing's holding it up except the hand of God. And it's just an amazing thing to me that Job at this particular time has this insight. I'm not sure if it's in this particular chapter, but I know there was a verse in Job that back in the 1700s, I think, and I can't remember his name, he's regarded as the father of hydrology, which is the study of water and how does water flow. And so there were a lot of misconceptions about how, if you think about this, the level of the ocean, or where the ocean comes up to meet the land, it stays relatively constant, right? And you would think if it was just raining and flowing into that body of water that it would continue to fill up, and yet it doesn't. And so this man, this scientist, he was a Christian, and he was reading through Job, and he reads this particular passage, not necessarily this one, but somewhere here in the book of Job, where it talks about the waters, the cloud drops the rain, and the water goes into the ground, and there's these rivers and all this kinds of stuff, and he begins to investigate this. And he finds out it is exactly the way God said that it was, that there's this continual cycle, not just with surface water, but even with underground water, that just continuously goes. And again, when you look at our world and how it's sustained, for someone to say that there is no God, I just don't see how you can honestly say that. Certainly it's not man-made and created.
These people that are real concerned about climate change said the ocean is rising. God made, he said, and I don't know where it's at, God made the ocean and said, don't get out of your bank.
That's exactly right.
And the waves will get out,
Yep.
but they'll go back.
Yep.
So they'll never get out.
No.
He told it not to.
And it's, I think, to me, my opinion, I think it's another attempt by our society, as humans have done since the Garden of Eden, to say, I'm God. We can look back through history and we see these weather patterns, these changes that occur naturally that God has set built into the system, if you will. And there's a distinct purpose behind it. And for puny man to think that he can control the climate is just foolish and folly. I remember in high school living out there near Lubbock, and you know, in the summertime, it obviously gets hot. It's very dry. You have cotton crops up there and other crops, but cotton primarily. And so at that particular time, we were going through this really long stretch without any rain and trying to figure out what to do. And a scientist said, well, we can make it rain. You just need to fly a crop duster through the right cloud, the right conditions, and we'll produce the rain. And it was very inconsistent, which again just pointed out, you know, man can't control, God's in control of all of that. But to me, this is just an amazing thing that this time in history, the book of Job, that as he's living this, he has this great insight on our world and what it looks like and how God has built this thing. In verses 5 and 6, what we see here, Job says, God sees everything, even the realm of the dead. Sometimes you talk to people about heaven and hell, and I've never heard it personally, but I've heard accounts from other people that said, you know, if God is in heaven, I don't want to go there because I don't want to be with God. Well,